everyone, Kate Luber here. I'm going to do a quick tutorial for you on my favorite ways to use the curves layer in Photoshop. The curves layer is one of the most versatile tools in Photoshop, and there are countless ways that you can use it. So there could be an entire class on the curves layer. So I'm just going to go over the three main ways that I use the curves layer. And those would be adjusting the brightness and the darkness in specific areas of the photo, adjusting contrast, and then also adjusting colors in the image. You can find the curves layer on the adjustment panel if you have it pinned to your toolbar. It's the little graph with the S in it, or you can go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Curves. Either way works. I always just keep it here because I use it quite a bit. I use all of these quite a bit, so I just keep this up so it's really easy and fast. So you're just going to open a curves layer. And once you have it open, you can see that your histogram is also right here. So it's a really easy way to see the visual representation of your exposure and where the data is falling. You can see we have quite a bit of highlights here. That's because overall it's a really bright image with a lot of white, and then we have a little bit of darkness down in here. And then we do have this little spike up here, which is going to be all of this white that's really bright. And that's the first thing I'm going to use a curves layer for, is this area of the photo is a little bit distracting to me because the eye is drawn to the brightest area of the frame. And in this case, it's not my subject. So I've got my subject here and I have her reflection here, but my eye keeps being drawn to this area. So I'm going to take a curves layer here that I already opened up, and I'm going to take this white slider and I am just going to drag it down, and maybe drag it down. And any of these pins, a really good trick for finding because sometimes it gets confusing, which way do I drag it? What does it do? Is you just grab it and you just drag it really far, and it'll be really obvious to see what it does when you pull it in a certain direction. If you mess up, you just delete that layer and you go grab a new layer. It's not a big deal. If you do this, you can always click on the pin that you did and you can hit delete that pin, and it's going to reset that curve back to neutral. So in this case, I want to deal with those highlights a little bit, actually more of the whites. So I'm going to take this and I'm just going to drag it straight down, and you can see it's getting a little bit darker. I don't want to take it too much or it starts to get a little bit gray and dingy. So we're just going to drag it to about right there, and then I'm going to invert my layer mask to basically turn it off. And I'm going to take a white brush at 50%, and I'm just going to slowly paint over that area. And you can see how it's getting a little bit darker. It's not going to get it completely darker, but it's enough that it makes it a little bit less distracting. Another thing I can do is I can come in here with another curves layer to brighten up my subject over here a little bit. I feel like she's pretty well lit over here, but on this side she's a little bit darker. So I'm just going to take an area a little bit lower than midtones. These middle areas are going to be your midtones. Left of your midtones are going to be your shadows and your blacks. And to the right of your midtones are going to be your highlights and your whites. So I'm going to take a little bit left of my midtones because she's a little bit darker here. I'm just going to take this and I'm just going to drag it up, and you can see how that brightens up the entire frame because it does a nice transition. So it's going to lighten those shadows as well, and it's going to lift the highlights a little bit also. And I'm going to take my brush because I really only want it on this side of the frame. So what I'm going to do actually, instead of a brush, is I'm going to take a gradient tool and I'm going to change my color to black, make sure I'm on the layer mask, and I want to mask off this side of the image. I'm just going to drag that across, and you can see I've added a gradient to my layer mask. And what that does is it takes that brightness adjustment off of this half of the photo. So it's only being applied here. And you can see how it's brightening up just this side of the photo. And it makes it a little bit more balanced. She's a little bit better exposed here. So those are the ways that you can lift shadows, lift or decrease highlights. You can also use curves to do a nice matte effect. It's not something I do a whole lot, but I will show you how to do it. I like to leave a pin here. Try not to change it. It's hard to get it right in the middle without changing it. A pin here. I'm just going to do a matte to the dark end. A pin here because I want these to stay anchored, and then all I'm going to do is I'm going to take this bottom pin and do a little swoop up. And what that's going to do is it's going to make those darks a little bit softer. If you like to matte your highlights, all you would do is you would anchor those same spots and then you would bring those highlights down a little bit more, and you can see how that gives it that matte effect. We're going to remove that because I don't really like matte effect, but now you know how to do it. The next way I like to use curves is to add contrast to my image. There's already a fair amount of contrast, but contrast is really easy to do in curves. There are a lot of these presets here that deal with contrast, increased contrast, linear contrast, medium contrast, and strong contrast. You're welcome to use those, or you can use your own. I generally just pop my own little S-curve. I brighten the highlights, and I darken the darks. And the great thing about Photoshop is you can work in layers. When you use the curves in Lightroom, it applies to the entire image. Whereas when you do this in Photoshop, you have the ability to mask certain things off. So if I only want to apply contrast to her reflection, then I can do this contrast layer, and then I can invert that layer so it turns it off. And then I take my brush on white to reveal what's underneath on that layer. And then I can just paint onto her, and that's just going to add some contrast just to her. Like highlights, contrast is really draws the eye. So if you have an area that is really important in the image, sometimes it helps to add contrast and a little bit of brightness, and that naturally encourages the viewer's eye to go to that important area of the photo. So I would add a little bit of contrast just to her. I might even add a little bit more. So just increase those adjustments a little bit. And you can see there's a little bit of a halo around her. I would be a lot more careful if I was doing this for real, but for the sake of time, you get the idea. The last thing I like to do in Photoshop, in curves in Photoshop, not the last thing, but the last thing I'm going to cover today, is dealing with color. And you can see we have mixed light here. We've got light overhead, we've got light coming from under the mirrors, and then we have all of this natural light flooding in from the windows behind her. And that gives us a lot of blue in these, especially in these dark tiles. All of these white walls right here are blue. And then over here on this end, we've got correct white balance. So what we're going to do is we are going to use the quick mask tool, or quick selection tool, and I am going to select her because I don't want to adjust her because her coloring is accurate. It's just the background. And again, this is going to be kind of a quick, imprecise selection for the sake of time. Select mask. And that is actually a pretty good selection on her. So we're going to do OK. And I'm going to come back in and I'm going to add a curves layer. And that automatically applies that layer mask, except it's inverted. So I'm going to hit Control I. And you can see she's blacked out. So any adjustment I do on this curves layer is going to apply to it, all of the image except for her. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now select one of the color channels, and this color cast is primarily blue, so I'm going to go to my blue channel, and I'm just going to drop, and it's mostly in the shadow, lower midtones, but it's going to affect everything, and I'm just going to drop those blues, and you can see those blues fading away. Once I remove those, it's going a little bit green for me. So I'm now going to go to the green channel, and I'm going to take that same spot and I'm going to lower the greens. That's getting us a little bit more towards neutral. And then we can go to the reds and play around with that. It's pretty close. And then it's also on this side of the image, and we obviously don't want it on there. So we're just going to take a brush on 50%, and we're just going to brush off of this half of the photo where the hall light was in the image, and we're going to balance that out a little bit more. Changing my size, and you can see where I've overlapped here, and you can see that blue coming back out. So I'm going to paint over that a little bit. And I think we're still a little too blue after I've done that. So we're going to drop that blue even a little bit. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Drop that blue even a little bit more. Increase the reds. And it's all just kind of playing around with those sliders and seeing what you can do to get the most neutral color. And I think I'm pretty happy with that. You can see what a drastic difference there was and how blue that is, and we're able to remove that. I'm going to show you one last trick for how I use the curves layer to do a quick and easy vignette on an image. So I'm going to take one last curves layer, and you can just drop those midtones down, and then you're going to take a large black brush, and I usually do it at about 50%, and I'm going to start kind of a medium large brush, and I'm going to click it off, and you can see the area here on her head, and then I'm going to make it a little bit larger, and this is feathering it out a little bit more to make it natural. Make it a few clicks larger. Keep making it larger, and then we have a little natural vignette around her. And because I started with a small brush, a little bit bigger, and then kept making it bigger, that does a natural feather. I do have my brush hardness set to 0%, but by varying the size, I feather it out even a little bit more, and I do that in a lot of my different adjustments that I do to make a really natural and soft transition and to avoid halos. So I hope that helped you get a little bit more familiar with curves layer, and I would love to answer any questions you might have. Thanks!